Welcome, everyone, to this webinar focusing on strategic crisis management in the European Union. My name is Michael Creek, and I'll be your moderator for the next 90 minutes, which is brought to you by the Scientific Advice Mechanism of the European Commission. We've entitled this webinar, Entangled Crises. How can the EU help? And I think this word entangled really summarizes not only the multiple crises that we're facing. We think about COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, the war in Ukraine, but also beyond those most prominent crises, we face a whole range of challenges. And entangled certainly also represents the complexity and interconnectedness of the effects of these crises. Our focus today is on crisis management. How can we better prepare for these crises, respond to them when they happen, and recover from them afterwards? And although, of course, we're aware that many of the effects of these crises are global, our focus here is on what should the European Union's role be to help. This webinar also sees the launch of 3 key documents put together by independent experts advising the European Commission precisely on what that role should be. Here on the left, you see the evidence review report from sapea. This 300-page document looks at evidence from across a whole range of case studies and examples and puts forward policy options on what Europe's role can be. In the center here, you see the scientific opinion. This comes from the European Commission's group of 7 chief scientific advisors, and it puts together a set of policy recommendations on the shape that Europe's role can take. Here on the right, you also see a statement from the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies, entitled Values in Times of Crisis. This statement, put together by a separate independent group of experts, looks at values which are not only under threat at times of crisis, but also the values that help to shape our response and the role these values play. And I'm delighted to be joined by 3 representatives from the groups who have put together each of these 3 key policy documents. First of all, Tina Gomez, who is chair of the sapea working group, which put together the evidence review report. Tina is full professor of decision theory and ICT for resilience at the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands. Maarja Kruusmaa is one of the chief scientific advisors, one of the group of 7 advisors to the European Commission. She is professor of biorobotics and vice rector at Tallinn University of Technology in Estonia. And Barbara Prainsack. She is a professor at University of Vienna in Austria, where she specializes, among other fields, in ethical dimensions of biosciences. And she is chair of the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technology that put together the statement on values. So we'll be hearing from our 3 speakers in a moment, but after we've heard from them, we'll be joined by 3 additional speakers sharing their perspectives from the implementation of crisis management. We'll start with Hans Das from the European Commission's DG ECHO. That's the Directorate General for Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid, where he is Director of Emergency Management and Director of rescEU, the mechanism which strengthens cooperation on civil protection. HP Schreinemachers is Director of National Crisis Management and National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism at the Dutch Ministry of Justice and Security. And Shivangi Chavda is Senior Regional Lead for Asia and Europe at GNDR, that's the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction, a network of over 1,400 organizations across 127 countries. I'm very curious to hear their thoughts and perspectives on what Europe's role should be. But finally, we'll be joined by additional speakers from among yourselves. This is a fishbowl conversation, which means we'll start with 3 fish, then 6, but we will open it up to additional fish. So if you have a point you'd like to share, please do share it in the chat. You're very welcome to introduce yourself in the chat right now. Please do find the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and you can select to everybody so we all see your messages. And feel free to share your name, your organization, your sector, and perhaps what brings you to this webinar. What's your interest in strategic crisis management? So please don't hesitate to share that now. And as the conversation goes on, feel free to post your questions and comments in the chat. If you have clarification questions, I can put them to our speakers, or if you have a point you'd like to make, we'd love to invite some of you to join, switch on your video and audio and join the conversation. So I'll be inviting you to do that later on. But for now, I'd like to welcome our first 3 speakers. So Tina Gomez, Maarja Kruusmaa, and Barbara Prainsack. Please switch on your video. And great, Maarja, please feel free to join us as well. For our opening words, you can just start your video. And I'll start with Tina. So you are chair of the sapea working group that put together the evidence review report. Would you like to share a little bit about your work on that report?
Yes, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here with all of you. And if I understood it correctly, I'm the first fish in your bowl.
That's it.
So it is indeed a great honor and pleasure to share with you our insights about the sapea evidence review report that we've put together in a big working group, gathering the best expertise in Europe on the topic of strategic crisis management in the EU. And, you know, crises have affected all of our lives over the past months, years. And as broad as the impact on our lives, on the economy, on the environment, on health, on well-being, on safety and security, are also the topics that are falling under the umbrella of strategic crisis management in Europe. And equally broad is then also our evidence review, where we really tried to pull together evidence from very different fields that ranges from governance and law to trust, inequality, participation, and technology. So we are very happy and proud that we, managed to put together such a multidisciplinary endeavor. We also know, and that's what I just said, the EU and we as Europeans have been confronted with many crises. And it is impossible to go in detail about each crisis that we have experienced, let alone what we will experience. Therefore, what we try to do in our evidence review is distill the generic principles that allow us to manage, address, think about, and respond to different crises that will occur in the future. And we've interlaced that. I saw the link to all the 3 reports is in the chat with some very concrete examples and case studies that ranges from cybersecurity. I've seen there was just an incident in the parliament, to wildfires. It's not the season anymore, but it was definitely very hot in summer. And what we can see now from the scientific evidence is that crises have become the new normal. We have settled into many new normals in the COVID-19 response. And while there was then always this discussion, when can we go back to normal, or is it now the new normal? I would say that we have to realize we are and will be confronted with an increasing number and severity of crises. And now, of course, Europe and we Europeans have always been confronted with crises. Crises are not new. We've been wars, we've seen plagues, we've seen a different geopolitical crisis. But what is new is that we see they're increasingly going beyond any single member state or sector. Crises are transboundary. This is driven by 2 factors, mainly. First, climate change. Of course, this is a global phenomenon and can only also be treated globally. We've just seen the end of the COP. And we felt, of course, a very hot summer and increasing extreme weather events. But maybe also, I mean, very dramatically, we are now going through the 6th extinction event. Like, you know, think dinosaurs. So there have been previously 5 extinction events, and we are now living through the 6th. And we really can't oversee yet the consequences of that. So this is one factor that will definitely amplify what we are confronted with. The other one is that our systems and our societies are increasingly interconnected. That alone maybe would not be as bad if we would keep buffer capacities and redundancies, but we also try to be very, very efficient, meaning that we just go to the cheapest producer or source of food, wheat, oil, gas. And that makes us very, very dependent on very few sources. So these dependencies, combined then with a lack of redundancy and diversity, mean that we increasingly see these cascades, meaning that there is no sector, region, or country that is unaffected by crises that may happen very far away. Therefore, these new crises that we are increasingly confronted with ask us to think and coordinate across sectors, across a society, I would say, across countries and regions, and to coordinate. And that also means that for these transboundary crises, we see a role for the EU as the body that brings all parties together. Another point is that time is running out. Crises push us to act and react very, very rapidly to very complex problems, where you normally would like to deliberate, discuss, think. And of course, this is challenging. It is then challenging to oversee, for instance, the implications of crisis decisions for economic prosperity and growth, for equality, inequality, societal fragmentation, stability, for our chances to combat climate change or the loss of biodiversity. And what we think we need to recognize is that response to one crisis can create amplifying risks or crises for another region or sector. And therefore, we argue that risk management and crisis management, which have been traditionally very separate areas, need to be thought together. That needs to become integrated. Now, Winston Churchill famously said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Because we live in an era of constant crisis that also amplify each other, this notion of polycrisis that has been brought up various times, managing crisis will need to become an integral part of how we also set strategic directions. Now, I've talked about urgency, about complexity, about Entangled crisis, this webinar, that's all very sort of daunting doomsday words. But I would also say that there is hope. Our evidence review also shows that over the past decades, the European Union, the member states, but also we here as scientists have developed a broad range of tools and methods for crisis management. For instance, we have now more data, information, monitoring tools than ever before. And in our review, we've put together, various opportunities and also policy options that we highlight. For instance, improving information sharing and coordination, using new tools for harmonized monitoring, of course, also respecting GDPR and ethical standards, with a role for the EU also in that. Strategic foresight, scenario analysis, training of decision makers at all levels, so not just the firefighters and first responders, but the people who actually are responsible for responding to crisis. Investing in data preparedness, establishing strong knowledge networks, also for the rapid advice in crisis, or better risk and crisis communication, all can contribute to a better strategic crisis management in Europe. You can see all that on a very long report, that is posted in the link. But also on the basis of this evidence review and the evidence-based policy options that we put forward, the group of chief science advisors has developed their recommendations. And with that, I would like to hand it back and hand over, and I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Tina, for highlighting the extent of the problem, but also offering some of these policy options and potential solutions. And you provide the perfect segue into hearing from Maarja Kruusmaa, one of the 7 chief scientific advisors to the European Commission, to hear more about this scientific opinion, what is in there and what can Europe do?
Indeed, Tina put together a very thorough report on, hundreds and hundreds of references to scientific literature, having 30 experts or more looking for evidence. So scientific advisors look at scientific evidence, how to help policymakers to make better decisions. And in this case, the scientific opinion was requested by Commissioner Schreinemachers, Commissioner for crisis management in the EU, for looking at what he could do better in managing a crisis in Europe. And indeed, one of the most important consequences or conclusions from Tina's work is, as she said, crises are becoming more common, they become more cascading, they become more transboundary and transborder. And this is not just because every generation thinks that she or he lives the worst generations and before there were good times. There indeed were good times in Europe, and there were also bad times in Europe. But there indeed are 2 main factors that drive of this entanglement of crises. One is globalization, including the climate change, and another is interconnectedness that we never had before in the history. And this is very much why we characterize our world as a complex. Well, complexity means nothing really tangible for a common sense. It just seems that things are messy. But complexity for a scientist means a certain kind of a system, which they can define, describe, and model. This is a kind of a system where you have very many players, very many autonomous entities that have very many linkages with each other. And this also means that this kind of systems are non-linear. What non-linearity means is that you could have a little change in one part of the system, and suddenly the consequences of that would be all over the place. Well, think of, for example, a cyber attack of one of the servers of a global company, which would put down all the servers around the world and then all the logistics of the company. And that would affect to other sectors and could be just a small thing happening somewhere, maybe the adversary even not imagining that the effect would be that large. So what European Commission is interested in that case is how do we manage a crisis better? And therefore we were also looking at the current state of the art of European crisis management. One of the clear conclusions is that since crises do not come in silos anymore, then the European Union or practically any government of the member state of every country in the world doesn't have the luxury of fighting one crisis at a time. So crises don't come in silos. The government shouldn't work in silos either. And we can also see in Europe that knowledge hubs and mechanisms for bringing resources together for crisis management is important step in the right direction. We need to work rapidly across silos, much more rapidly than we did before. So I think we think Europe definitely needs horizontal mechanisms how to distribute resources, and how to quickly share informations and share decisions with each other. Crises are also characterized by a lot of uncertainty. When you're making decisions, those decisions are made under imperfect conditions and imperfect information. You have to make decision because not making a decision will also have a cost, and maybe sometimes a high cost. And you don't have time to reflect forever. So one part of the horizontal collaboration in information sharing. We put a lot of effort in also our scientific opinion to give recommendations about better information sharing. And one of those aspects I would like to emphasize here is how to represent information for the decision makers. As I said, decision makers are under a high cognitive load when they're making the decisions, under high stress. And you don't give them an Excel table for 200 columns, you know, this is how the flood damage looks like. You need to give them an explainable information that is quickly digestible. And that's a quite hard quest for information science and data science, how to make information explainable and understandable for the decision makers. And besides that, I mentioned uncertainties. The information that you're giving to the decision makers is uncertain. So think you're a decision maker and you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision because time is running out. And think is that you're given an information and you're very sure about this information. Suppose this information is the extent of damage after floods. And think of that you don't have this information, or you have just the information which you know is uncertain. Somebody comes to you, this is my information about damage under floods, but that could be 50% off. So you can think that as a decision maker, your decision could be different under those two conditions. And as scientific advisor, we find it to be very important that besides the information, we also give the decision makers some margins of uncertainty coming with that information, because that really can very much affect the decisions that they are making. And when it comes to decision making, again, science is fact-based, science is evidence-based, but decision making is actually value-based. So all the decisions the decision makers are making our value-based decision given our evidence. You can't kind of separate at that phase, you can't separate them from each other anymore. And we also here find very important that we have good recommendation for the decision maker how to communicate your decisions for society. I remember very well one quote or one saying from an expert of Tina's workshop who said that citizens these days don't want to be saved. Citizens these days want to tell the savers how they want to be saved. And they also want to be actively part of saving themselves, but they also actively want to be part of saving others. So there is a huge potential in the civil society and also in the private sectors, how the decision makers can actively involve them saving themselves or helping them saving themselves and using all the potentials that there is. I remember another saying from an economist in another workshop who said that most of the wealth in the world is private. There is a lot of money in private hands. And you could say, for example, in the Ukrainian war, you couldn't anticipate there are companies who are donating firefighting equipment or drones or, medical supplies or something. And this is going in silos, parallel to what the governments are doing. So we find it extremely important to have all these initiatives coordinating by the decision makers already now, before the crisis hits, how to get the civil society and how to get the private sector to play together with the decision makers. When it comes to value-based decisions, I was very glad that this times we could work very closely together with a European group of ethics who gave us also a very valuable and complementary insight into the crisis and decision-making under pressure. So I'm sure that there's time now for the third fish in the bowl to give her opinion about that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Maarja. And you've given us some great insight as well into the real challenges that decision makers face when putting together policy. And as you say, a lot of these decisions are values based. And yeah, again, it's the perfect moment to hand over to Professor Barbara Prainsack to hear about the statement that the European Ethics Group put together on this. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you also to Maarja for already highlighting how policy making is always infused with values. But let me start in the beginning. The evidence review report, the scientific opinion highlights, and the European Group on Ethics echoes this, that having good evidence, scientific evidence, and also evidence on how different crises affect different groups of people is very, very important. Also evidence on the causes of crises, of course. We support that, and we also highlight, as Maarja already outlined, we highlight the role that values play, not only, but in particular, in strategic crisis management. So as every policymaker will know, not only the policy instruments that we choose, but also the way we label a problem or a challenge is already a value judgment, whether we want it or not. And it's not something bad. Let's just look at the very notion of a crisis. Every loss of human life is a tragedy, but we do accept, we as societies accept deaths and casualties from sexualized violence, from racialized violence, in some parts of the world and also in our societies without problem, without calling it a crisis. In other contexts, the loss of life is seen as a crisis. So this inherently already reflects some of the value judgments that we are making. So when something turns from a problem into a crisis is, of course, as Tina has very well articulated, related to questions such as systems capacity, can a system deal with it, and so on and so on. Our institutions fit to deal with a problem? If not, then it's a crisis. But it's also a value judgment. So values are always already there. It's not about inserting them. It's about ideally deliberating about them. So what values do we want to underpin our policies and measures? But in a crisis situation, you cannot have a public deliberation on values, right? So in a crisis situation, however, and this is what we say among other things in our statement, it's still helpful for policymakers to make explicit the values that certain ways of posing a problem, but especially the solutions, what values underpin them. This is important in a democracy because it opens up these values to scrutiny. It can also help people to better understand why certain decisions have been made, why certain choices have been made over other potential choices. And ideally, it can also help to create support for good measures, right? So making values explicit is an important endeavor as such. And if it's being ignored, and to some extent this has happened certainly in the pandemic and also in other crises that we're currently seeing. If values are ignored, then it will come back to bite the decision makers. So against this backdrop, the European Group on Ethics talk about various values that are important in strategic crisis management. And one value that we foreground in particular is solidarity. And not because we claim that solidarity has such a glorious history in crisis management or crises. Actually, we all know examples, I'm sure, of where solidarity has been mobilized for, just to ask people to do things without giving them any support. Many citizens are tired of being asked things in the name of solidarity. Solidarity is also regularly mobilized for nationalistic and also military purposes sometimes. So, but there is a way to use solidarity in a fruitful manner that has a lot to offer to strategic crisis management. So one of our key arguments is that it hasn't been used as it should have, and it has a lot to offer. What does it have to offer? What really makes solidarity stand out over other values that are also important in crisis management? Respecting people's privacy, liberty, equity, all of those are important, justice, all of those are important values. What makes solidarity stand out is that it acts upon what people have in common. And in the crisis, it really gets to the essence of what we have in common, our shared human vulnerabilities, our need to be safe from violence, to be safe from natural disasters. So solidarity helps us to develop policies that address the needs of as many people as possible. And the solidarity doesn't lend itself so easily to pitching the interests and needs of people against each other. And this is one of the big risks also in crises, that there's a kind of inward looking, we've seen this unfortunately, inward looking a pursuit of individual national interests at the cost of everyone else. We've also seen this play out in other fields. So solidarity helps us to create policies at national levels, at supranational levels, and also at global levels that address those shared human vulnerabilities, rather than pitching people, countries, groups against each other. And at the very least, what solidarity does is that it makes us critically consider what groups and people our policies prioritize, who and why we exclude people. It makes us scrutinize policies that exclude non-citizens, for example. So it doesn't necessarily always prescribe what to do, but it's an additional safeguard to make sure that our exclusions and inclusions are just. So it also helps justice. And of course, needless to say, solidarity and justice are really enshrined as important values in EU primary and secondary law. And my last point is that, and this is probably one of the lessons from the ongoing and recent crises, that institutionalized solidarity is actually key. It's not so much about asking people to enact solidarity with each other, which they do when they can, but it's also about providing support for people, economic support, social support, psychological support, societies where these supports are there, systems of support are there, institutional solidarity is there. Those societies tend to get through crisis better. And actually, the EGE says that there's a positive duty of governments to combat poverty, because that's the main lesson from crisis, that we haven't learned sufficiently that people who live in poverty are hit harder and earlier than everyone else. So I leave it there. There's more in the statement. We hope that you will flip through it, if not read it. So thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Barbara, for raising a lot of really important issues around the notion of values. And as you say, when a crisis hits, we don't have time to have this discussion about values. So it's great that you are participating in this conversation now, that we can take the time to do so. Please stay with us, all three of you, for this conversation. We're going to bring in our next three fish in just a moment, but I'd like to remind all of you watching the webinar as attendees that the chat is there for your questions and comments, and we'd love it if you're willing to join us in the conversation as well in just a moment. So please don't hesitate to type your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll take it from there. But as I say, please stay with us, Tina Gomez, Barbara Prainsack, and Maarja Kruusmaa, as I bring in our next three fish. And I'd like to invite you to start your video, Hans Das, HP Schreinemachers, and Shivangi Chavda. You're very welcome to join us here. And I'm very curious to hear your responses to what we've heard so far. We're very grateful to have you with us, each joining from different perspectives in terms of implementation of strategic crisis management. And perhaps we could come to you first, Hans Das, to hear your thoughts on the what's been expressed so far. Over to you, Hans.
With great pleasure. Thank you very much, Michael. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. All right, yes. Very good. Let me first of all thank Tina, Maarja, and Barbara for sharing their very interesting and very relevant insights. And we're very much in the middle of all of these developments. I am the director responsible for emergency management and rescEU in DG ECHO. So we're the part of the Commission that deals with civil protection and humanitarian aid. And we manage the Emergency Response Coordination Center, the ERCC, which is basically the main crisis center in the Commission nowadays. And so we very much share the analysis that underlies a lot of the thinking here. We see crisis growing in number, in severity, and in frequency. It's related to climate change, as was mentioned. It's also related to the evolving security landscape that we're living in. And it's certainly also related to increasing vulnerability on our own side. I think Europe as a whole is becoming more vulnerable because of a number of developments, urbanization, population growth, but also interdependencies and interconnectedness, as was mentioned. And a disaster has a lot more impact nowadays than it used to have 50 years ago. And that is because everything is linked in nowadays world. So a sectoral crisis is a thing that doesn't exist. If it's sectoral, it's presumably not a crisis. A crisis is by definition cross-sectoral. So we very much like what we hear in all of these presentations. We very much like what we see in the recommendations of the various reports also. And I think the one that I want to focus on for just 30 seconds is the networked approach, which I think is the only response possible in this sort of modern nowadays life where everything is connected. We need to have a networked approach where very quickly we can bring all of the relevant sectors together, and we need to be able to act on all of these relevant sectors. And the best example that we have right now, I mean, COVID was one, but the example now is obviously the war in Ukraine, where we have very quickly developed our center, the ERCC, from what was traditionally a civil protection center focused on floods, fires, and that sort of thing, towards a center that can work very cross-sectorally and that can basically provide support now in all areas where Ukraine needs support. So we're providing energy-related support, we're providing digital support, we're providing agricultural support on top of the more traditional health and humanitarian types of support that we always provide. We work across the sectors. We try and coordinate the different commission services on all of these aspects. And we've started working big time with the private sector. And I fully agree with Maarja. There is so much potential in the private sector that we need to tap into, and we need to make that much more structural for the future. The private sector can be a part of the solution to this problem. Final point from my side is that I think what we need to do much more is to work across sectors and to try to think ahead of the curve. What we really call anticipation. We have been too reactive in the past, I think, responding to whatever crisis develops. We need to try and be much quicker and much more proactive and much more anticipatory in our action. And we're doing fantastic work on that already now. I'm trying to see sort of how, for instance, the war in Ukraine can develop further, what other escalation scenarios are possible, etc., and how we can prepare for that now rather than waiting until it happens. And that we then try to do also through rescEU, which is the EU strategic reserve of all sorts of response capacities, where right now we're investing very significant amounts of funding in all sorts of preparedness for the EU, going from CBRN to energy-related support to shelter or health-related support, etc. So lots of work ongoing, and all of these recommendations are extremely welcome. I'll leave it at that for now, Michael.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hans Das, for giving us an insight there into what the Commission is already doing. And as you say, bringing up this important question of how we can be better prepared for crises to come. We'll explore this certainly more in the conversation, but here I'd like to bring in HP Schreinemachers. You are Director of National Crisis Management in the Netherlands. What are your thoughts here on the European response and how it can be linked with national level?
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Indeed, I have to correct you a little bit. I used to be the Director for National Crisis Management in the Netherlands until a year ago, when I started a new position here at the Netherlands Perm Rep in Brussels. And I participate in the integrated political response mechanism, but a crisis response mechanism, I should add, but also in the ad hoc working party on resilience and crisis management, where we discuss many of these issues. So I can both bring in the perspective of the national level, but also from an EU point of view. So I've read the 3 reports with a lot of interest. And I can also wholeheartedly endorse much of the recommendations and welcome, for example, the taxonomy, but also the concepts and the frameworks described, because what we really need is a common language here. And one of the things that I've noted over especially the past year, is that we do not yet have a common language when it comes to crisis management here in the EU context. So that is all very welcome, and it's also welcome because much of what I've read is also in line with some of the Council conclusions of November 21 on resilience and crisis management, but of course much more eloquent, much more evidence-based, thought through. So in that sense, it's really a very welcome addition to the thinking that's already been going on. But we should not just agree being on a panel, because then it gets a little bit boring, maybe. So I'll try to take up the glove as has been thrown into the arena by these 3 reports and by the presenters of today. In my opinion and experience, we've handled crisis management with gloves on. And we've been discussing fishbowl analogies. I will throw in some glove expressions here. Gloves on. And that is since we were taking into account all the sensitivities between the local and the national level, the national and the European level. We've handled with care the sectoral versus the horizontal differences. We have the sensitivities between the institutions such as the Council and the Commission. And we've also been very sensitive towards the public in general, because every time we see a crisis appearing on the horizon, we wait way too long with informing the public, because we don't want them to be in a crisis mode when we are not sure yet whether the crisis is actually will actually hit us or not. But in my sense, and I think many of the recommendations underline that too, we cannot afford to tiptoe our way around these sensitivities any longer. We need to, at all these levels, to work hand in glove and overcome these sensitivities. But what are we starting to see? Of course, there are some encouraging signs, but there are also some signs that we are now putting much effort in improving the sectoral instruments, which doesn't always help the horizontal aspects. So, for example, if you look at all the market interventions that from various sectoral instruments are being proposed now, it's a wide area, and we're not always designing new or the same solutions to the same problems, but in all these sectors come up with different ideas. And we really need to bring that more together, because now we risk fragmentation, duplication, and gaps. So another thing that I didn't quite agree with reading the report was that somewhere it says there is a gap between structures, processes, and mechanisms of Commission and Council. But while these tensions between both sides may be inevitable shortcomings, it may not be an urgent one. And in my mind, these are very urgent ones that we need to really address. It's been said before, Europe needs horizontal measures, and Hans also alluded to it. We need a networked approach, and I think much still needs to be done in all these levels. So what should we do? I'm really glad that Hans' ERCC has become much more prominent within the Commission, but also within the Brussels arena. So in coordinating between the sectors and really playing that horizontal role. In the report, it also says that IPCR, which is a council mechanism, may be the most promising and perhaps most effective tool at this point, but is still used infrequently. And I would add there, only after crises are occurred and not in preparation yet. So really the Council needs to step up its efforts to really create or utilize this horizontal mechanism, and not only use it when the crisis has already hit, but also use it for preparedness, anticipation as well. And I think we need to do it faster than we're doing now. The Council conclusions are from the Slovenian presidency in November 21. Then the French presidency put out a questionnaire, which is always a very solid European response. Now another response under the Czech presidencies. We're designing a roadmap. But hey, we really should start to get working on these things. And I think the recommendations by the reports are very helpful in getting that sense of urgency out there and helping us design these new procedures. Finally, we also need to better connect the national structures and the EU structures. From my experience, we really needed to design this connection early on in the COVID crisis, and it took a long time before we finally found out how we were going to cooperate. Since we have created an informal DG network on DGs on national crisis centers, but also that network is still in development, and I think this could really, if we were able to better connect this network to what we're doing here in Brussels, then I think the national level would have a lot more buy-in. And finally, we should start treating the public as grown-ups For example, right now, we have risk analysis that say that the war in Ukraine might bring about CBRN risks, and instead of trying to shove that under the carpet, we really should address it and should start informing our public about these risks, not to alarm them, but to make them better prepared. So, in all, I think it's time to take the gloves off. As Tina said, we're running out of time, and the next crisis is already forming itself and will be on our doorstep very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, HP, for setting out these very clear challenges. And I'm really looking forward to hearing how our other speakers respond to those challenges as well and step up to address these important issues. We're going to throw it open, but I'd first like to hear from Shivangi Chavda. We've already mentioned the important role that civil society organizations play in response to crises. And Shivangi Chavda from GNDR, you represent a huge number of civil society organizations. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts with a particular focus on what we can learn from civil society organizations' work.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Good morning, all, and really feel very honored and privileged to be part of this very enriching discussions on entangled crisis in Europe. I think not a decade ago we were discussing this, but now that we have realized that the nature of risk is systemic and cascading, we heard from our fellow colleagues about that. And we also realized that the impacts are cross boundaries, but let's also not forget that the impacts of crises such as Ukraine war has also kind of put pressure on global South in terms of fuel and food security. And therefore, it becomes very important that this cross-boundary governance or partnerships or network, as what Hans was mentioning, requires to be strengthened more and more. And this is going to happen. We have seen it in COVID as well, in terms of the health priorities and how the trade in aid was happening across the borders, where the communities most in need were kind of neglected because of the arrangements between the countries. So I think that's one realization, definitely. What Tina mentioned earlier about, the need for the risk management and crisis management requires to be now integrated. From our perspective as civil society organizations, we have been talking about resilience building. And when we start talking about resilience building, it also means that we are talking about risk-informed development. So any development approach that we take should embed the risk, but this risk should be informed by the communities who are in the front line. Often the development processes and the risk management processes and the crisis management, they all work in silos. And therefore, we think that risk-informed development is an imperative to ensure that the economic losses and also the impacts which we saw in and sitting in India in this part of the world, we have faced it more, and that is the lesson that we would also like to bring it to some parts of this European countries whom we deal with. It's very happy to see that the report recognizes the need to collaborate with all societies and also states that there is a need for tailor-based approaches. There is also need, and there's a reflection, to have a deeper understanding on the underlying stresses of the communities that they face in spite of the stronger infrastructure or enabling mechanisms or enabling governance mechanisms. We often assume that the voices of the communities are heard by these matured nations, but often they are not heard. And I can bring you an example from Finland, where we are working with civil society organizations and they are working with the communities who are facing a psychosocial trauma because of the migration which is happening cross-border because of the Ukraine war. So I think how do we kind of recognize these challenges that the communities are facing on day-to-day basis and how that can be addressed, because that definitely is going to impact on the social fabric at a longer run. So that's one. The other point that I wanted to make was on the localization aspect, and that's the buzzword. I think everybody sitting here has heard about this word called localization. But I think more and more local communities needs to be empowered. And I think various of our speakers have said that the communities into the decision-making processes have to be institutionalized. We see still communities as a mere observer or a participant, but not really a part of a decision-making process. So just having an elected representative does not mean that the communities are really sitting forward to make the decisions on risk and resilience. And it's important that we create that enabling mechanisms at the national level and then kind of make it bottom top. And lastly, I would think, and I'd say that there's need to learn from the global south up higher. Now more and more in my kind of talking points, I should have said that before, that there are ample experiences and expertise now lying in global south of managing the complex risk. It's important that we kind of bring this learning from the global south to global to global north. And we see really very good examples now, like countries like Philippines or Indonesia, who have been kind of dealing with the crisis management and the complex crisis management for a very, very long time. How can we bring this learning together for the communities from this part of the world to global north? So these are some of my rapid reflections on the report. Yeah, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you very much for highlighting the importance of connecting with the needs and vulnerabilities of affected groups on the ground. You give some really crucial examples. And just a reminder, and thank you very much to everyone who's watching and commenting in the chat. Some really interesting points coming up. I encourage as well our speakers to have a look at what's coming in. And we'd love to invite some of you that have commented to join the conversation in just a moment. But I first wanted to give our first three speakers a chance to respond to the responses. We've had some really interesting challenges, thoughts expressed by Hans, Shivangi, and HP. And I wonder if I can come back to you, Tina, Maria, and Barbara, for some thoughts on this. Would any of you like to pick up any burning issues in particular you'd like to respond to? Tina.
Maybe I would first like to say that I'm also super happy that I spotted so many of the working group members in the list of participants, some also active in the chat. I think you can also, I don't know how the video policy is, but I saw David Rios, David Alexander, Arjen Boyne, Panos, cybersecurity. Did I forget somebody? Yeah. But Thomas Elmquist also here. So wonderful that you can all join us, and that also means if you have specific questions addressing specific parts of the evidence review report, we have a huge network of expertise also here around the table. Yeah, maybe the challenge was with the take the gloves off challenge. Maybe I would respond to that, and then also, Arjen, of course, commented already in the chat, basically given the question a bit back to you, how can we bridge sort of this national towards to European? I think, from the literature, basically the need to coordinate is uncontested, right? That's what we see. That's also, I think, something that nobody debates. Then what we also see, there's sort of several layers that need to be brought together. Sort of the generic crisis management competence that ranges from monitoring, analyzing damage, satellite imagery, logistics, stockpiling, and so forth, with the specific domain expertise when you then go to food crisis, health crisis, financial crisis, whatsoever. And it is really, not a simple task to coordinate that. From also several discussions that we've seen, that's always also even discussion for a city hall, how to coordinate that. Now, if we go to European level, we have the challenge that we don't only have to coordinate sort of laterally across the sectors and so forth, but that we also have to coordinate various levels and various countries with different interests, potentially also sometimes different values, and that is definitely not easy. One of the things that we have discussed in the evidence review report is trying not to create any new institutions, but one really create networks, boards between the institutions that, where people know each other, can share information and then coordinate rapidly. That's one thing. And then the second was a framework to prepare, especially on the data and information exchange before a crisis hits. We very frequently hear things like, but you can't, you don't know what is coming at you, so you don't know what you have to prepare for. But actually, there is specific information that you will need in more or less any crisis. You will need information about the damage, you will need information about the infrastructure status, you will need information about the people affected, you will need to know what they need, and you will need to know what they need to communicate and how to get it there, or how to get people out, and so forth. So this, knowing that this information will be needed, almost certainly, of course, then you can start to discuss with the relevant member states and their organizations how you will organize that information exchange when a crisis hits. And you could also agree on specific protocols for instance, monitoring, risk assessment, and start to standardize these aspects. So there's some of the points that we cover in the evidence review. But of course, there's more also in the recommendations and also from a value perspective. And Arjen or David, if you want to jump in, I think that's also okay.
Great, yeah, and we can invite you to join the fishbowl in just a moment. Thank you very much, Tina. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Maarja, so you'd like to respond on this as well.
One comment to Shivangi about learning from the Global South. Learning is one of the ideas of the networking in general, I think, and definitely there are lessons to learn. We also had some sounding board events with civil protection people who said exactly that, said Global South has so many more experiences, how with very, very scarce resources to manage very difficult crises. And we have to be a little bit more humble and go and learn from there. Take, for example, the floods in Bangladesh that they handle better than they handle them in Germany, despite of having so much more money. So I think we just need to be a little bit more humble and go and ask, how do you do that with so little money and with so many people and still losing so few lives? So that's definitely that's definitely one of the important points, and learning and training is something which I think we have to do much more and much more often. We also had a lot of discussions with Tina and with other experts around a diversity of response. And one of the conclusions, again, from the scientific opinion is that to keep the diversity. It's very kind of an understandable natural instinct for every decision maker to unify everything, because then you feel kind of psychologically things are under your control. They're all very similar to each other. You know exactly what is happening, but you're ignoring the fact that the diversity might have a reason. Firefighting in Lapland could be different from firefighting in Andalusia. And there is a reason why also the procedures could be different. But here also, when we have a variety, we have a chance for learning from each other, to share the best practices. And I think also when it comes to ERCCs, this is where I see should have a bigger role in how to share these best practices with each other.
So yeah, diversity, again, as a source of concern to make sure that we're inclusive in our responses, but also as a strength that we can learn from the vast diversity across Europe and beyond. Thank you very much, Maarja. Barbara, I give you a quick moment to respond before we open the fishbowl a little further.
Yeah, I would also like to thank Shivangi for her intervention, because I think we don't talk about these aspects enough. So there's this wonderful saying that you can't big data your way out of a no data situation. And there's so many aspects, there's so many parts of crises that we haven't even captured. This includes, as Maarja has already pointed out, learning from the Global South. I won't elaborate on this because Maarja put it so well, but also when it comes to fighting misinformation and disinformation, there are wonderful solutions in Latin America, for example, that we can learn from. So we can learn, but we need to listen to people and communities everywhere, not only to the experts. And this is the moment to do it. So also because crisis management relies on people being able to and willing to comply with measures. And we know that sometimes people don't comply with measures, they break the rules because they are not psychologically, economically, or socially able to comply with them, or because the sets of measures are not seen as effective and fair and not responding to people's actual needs. And as Shivangi said, we assume too much and we listen too little. And this is very easily said, everyone says this, but when it comes to how to actually put this in practice, I think there's a very, very long way to go.
So building listening into this, into these systems and structures, we absolutely have our work cut out. I'd love to open the conversation further, and I'd like to invite one of our commenters in the chat. I saw David Alexander. You had a point you'd like to make about the scale and magnitude of the crisis that we face. I wonder if you'd like to share your video and audio and put your points to our speakers. Yeah, feel free to start video and audio so we can hear your question.
There you go.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity in this most august and learned panel to say something. It struck me over last summer that every time I turned on the television news, there was another disaster in Europe. And it strikes me that in the future, where we had perhaps 2,000 firefighters fighting a fire in the Garonne in southern France, well, next time we're going to need 20,000, not 2,000. The way things are going, we're going to need civil protection systems that are different to what we have now. We need the input of foresight to that, but we need those systems to be reconceptualized so that they are capable of coping with the intersectionality that we're dealing with. And that is intersectionality in about 4 ways. Apologies to people in cultural and gender and racial studies for borrowing their word. However, we're dealing with the intersection of different kinds of hazards and threats. We're dealing with the intersection of different kinds of decision making. We're dealing with the intersection of different kinds of social problem with the hazard problem. And we're dealing with the intersection between chronic needs and needs generated by sudden events, and the need to apportion resources which are always and will always be scarce. So I was recently at a conference in Denmark where there were some analyses of recent European emergencies. And what transpired from those analyses was that very little was managed well, quite honestly. These are analyses of events in Sweden and Germany, not to say the United Kingdom, where I honestly don't believe that any major emergency has been managed well over the last 35 years. And the reason for this is failure to complete, to maintain and to develop adequately national civil protection systems. Beyond that, we need those national civil protection systems to interact a great deal better at the international level. Great work going on in this, but my fear is with the decision makers who are failing to take this seriously and failing to recognize the scope of the threats. For example, what are we going to do about undersea warfare, which is an emerging risk? but it's only one emerging risk. And you might say that climate change is an emerging risk because we have to work out just what it is going to do in terms of major events. Think of this summer where we went from a situation where every day there were major forest fires in southern Europe. In a matter of 2 days, the weather broke and it was tornadoes, flash floods, microcyclones, and all the rest of it. An instant swing. So I think we need some rethinking to go on, above all among the politicians. And I think also
perhaps I can put your perhaps I can put this point to.
If I just finish my very last point,
Sure.
sorry to go on too much, but is that I think also that international collaboration within Europe is going to have to be rather different as well. At the moment, it is what you might call facultative. In other words, have you got a helicopter? Yes, here it is, or no, here it isn't. I think we're going to have a different system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So perhaps I can put this to Hans Das and HP Schreinemachers. Given the concerns that David raises over the intersectionality, as he says, and the complexity of these issues, the examples that he raises, but also the point that Arjen makes in the chat around the connection between national and European level, what do you think really needs to change? And perhaps, Hans Das, I can bring you in first on this.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, David, for the question, because it's a key question, and I share to a large extent the analysis you make. And I think the reality is that Europe has been spared from any major crisis or disasters for a very long time, until recently. I think with COVID and the war in Ukraine, the situation has of course changed, but before that, there was a very long period of relative quiet and calm sort of on the disaster front in Europe. Of course, some member states are much more exposed to crisis and natural disasters in particular than others. If you compare the risk profile of Italy, which literally has every natural disaster risk on the book and is exposed to that in a very regular way, with a country like Finland, which has virtually zero natural disaster risks, then of course you see a very different level of preparedness between those countries. But generally, I do think that we need to reinforce and valorize much more the work of the civil protection services. There has been underinvestment in civil protection in quite a few member states. There hasn't been an acute need for a long time. And I think the difficulty now is that we all see that we need to invest a lot more in prevention, and I am the first one to support that. And working on emergency management, I am more convinced than anybody else of the value of working on prevention. But at the same time, we need to invest simultaneously now in developing our response capacities collectively at European level, but also in member states. And there are some very, very difficult choices have to be made, because the nature of the work is no longer about just firefighting or just flood response. It has become much more technically intricate, much broader in scope, new types of risks, and etc. So we need to modernize civil protection across member states. We need to improve and increase it, and we need to make them much more cross-sectoral. And that intersectionality that you're referring to, I think, is the key challenge for civil protection services in the coming years. We need to be able to respond not just to the pure civil protection challenges in a disaster, but we need to respond in a much more holistic way, looking at how that intersects with other areas. Right now, half of my people are working on energy rather than on pure civil protection systems. And I think that is the right thing to do, because if we don't manage to restore the energy provision in Ukraine, then basically the humanitarian consequences, the civil protection consequences of that are enormous. So you need to be able to bring things together. there's lots of things I'd love to say on some of the other questions, but I sort of feel that Michael wants to move on. But you tell me, Michael, do I get another minute?
There's so much to cover here, yeah, but thank you very much for your clear response on that, and clearly reinforcement and investment needed on civil protection. A quick response, if I could ask David before I come to HP. David, would you like to respond?
I promise to shut up in just a second. I think we're going to need to reevaluate concepts such as welfare, which is very rarely defined. Pardon me, very rarely defined. Why is it very rarely defined? Because it's politically very inconvenient to define welfare. Other concepts, sovereignty, legality, and mobility, and in fact identity, as well as the protection of human rights at a time when democracy is actually very much in retreat in the world. So these are absolutely major questions which underpin the whole civil protection issue. Thank you.
Yeah, and I see our panel nodding in response as well. And there's some great work done in a literature review on definitions as part of the evidence review report, which covers some of these aspects. Thanks very much, David. HP Schreinemachers, I would love to come to you as well on this question of, because you've already talked about your feelings on the need for things to change and scale up. What are your thoughts on David's points?
Yeah, sure. So indeed, I recognize that intersectionality. I didn't know the word yet, but now I'm going to use it often. I described already the sensitivities that come with it. I agree with Hans that many of the member states have become a little lackluster in civil protection. The Netherlands, no exception to that. The only thing I would caution for is that the only answer is that the EU is going to solve all this. So I think, as we say, your national security is my national security. That also goes for your civil protection is my civil protection. So I think all the member states within the EU really have to step up and prepare for the risks that are arising at the horizon. We have not always been very good at it because, for example, in Netherlands a couple of years ago, I was responsible for doing a risk and threat analysis and then asking or discussing with all the other ministries whether they were ready to confront these challenges that we saw appearing on the horizon. And it was a tough discussion often because acknowledging that you're not prepared might bring your minister in political problems. So often there is a sense of let's not talk about it too much because the chance is only 1 in 5 years. So maybe that's the next minister who has to deal with it. So I think we have to become much more honest in addressing the gaps that we see when we're looking at the risks appearing. And the other question that you also already referred to is how, and it was Arjen Boyn's question on how to connect the national structures to the European structures. I do not agree with Tina that we do not need new structures. That might not be the board, the crisis governance board that she in the report alluded to, but we need at the council side at least a platform where we regularly discuss, sorry, something came in between, where we regularly discuss scenarios, preparedness, anticipation. Because, for example, when Hans' team designs cross-sectoral scenarios that we need to prepare for, he doesn't have a place in the council to go and bring them to where they can be discussed. So that would be the first thing to do. And the other thing I already mentioned, make use of the network of DGs of the National Crisis Center and the National Crisis Communicators Networks. We have all these great things out there, but we, as I said before, underutilize them, and we should do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these, again, very clear challenges for what needs to happen next. I wonder if I can bring in now, time is ticking, we have 10 minutes left, but I would love to bring in another fish to our fishbowl. Theodota Laguri, I wonder if I could invite you to join the panel here, join our little fishbowl. I saw that you had a point to make about science advice. So please do feel free to accept the invitation to switch on your, great, to switch on your video and audio.
Hello. Sorry, I cannot turn on my video right now, but I'm happy
No
to
problem.
see you all. So I would like to bring to the discussion the role of scientific evidence, that so much discussion is going on in other panels. I mean, how you see it, how you can tackle crisis and polycrisis, because it is not a last moment thing, I agree. But what is the role? There it must be a critical role, how you can foresee crisis, for example. So I would like if you can discuss this with your panelists. And thank you very much for this interesting discussion today, this morning.
Thank you very much for your questions. So yes, how can we make sure this connection between evidence and policy continues even when it's such an urgent time like a crisis? Maarja, would you like to respond on this?
Yeah, well, one clear recommendations that came out from all this evidence is that when you give a science advice, then it has to be multidisciplinary. Because crises are multidisciplinary these days. And it was very well observed with a COVID pandemic, for example, in many member states, including mine in Estonia, where we had scientific advisors who are very good virologists, very good epidemiologists, and maybe statisticians to calculate all the growth rates and everything. But in the same committees, we didn't have economists, we didn't have educational scientists, and so on and so forth. So we often missed the cascading effects because partly because of that, and now we have to deal with them. So that's definitely one of the very strict recommendations where a crisis breaks up in one silo. Also, Hans said that if it breaks up in a silo, it's not a crisis. But then already to look at the multidisciplinary science advice, how to prevent it from cascading. And another is definitely again, connected to uncertainty, communicate uncertainty. Also, it's very important for the scientific advisor to say if she doesn't know, if there is not enough evidence. Because, let's say, for a very experienced politician, the gut feeling is also a good decision maker if you don't have any scientific advice, because then it's totally value-based.
That's it. Great. Thank you very much for your responses here. I see perhaps Barbara, I can bring you in next on this.
So interestingly, I didn't hear everything that Maarja said because Maarja, you used a wake word for Siri and my Siri switched itself on. Anyhow, but what I wanted to add to this is that there's a lot of evidence that the policy making is often not evidence-based. So that's a kind of fact. So I think we need to compare, or we need to say how we want policy and crisis management to be evidence-based when in other contexts it's sometimes not, for reasons that have to do a lot with politics as well. So I think we need to also change the incentives for politics to help policy to be more evidence-based. To give an example, there's research suggesting that for politicians, this is a US-based study, it's very difficult, or I put it differently, politicians who link extreme weather events to climate change are seen as weak by conservative voters. So as long as our institutions and structures don't actually incentivize science-based and evidence-based policymaking, it will be a struggle for the best intended policymakers and for the best actionable scientific evidence to be really, really powerful.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this public perception, again, playing a really important role in how effective policy can be. Tina, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, from a bit of a different angle, because of course we tried to look into the evidence behind also especially the European mechanisms, because there are of course huge programs by REA to fund crisis and research on secure societies. And one of the striking things for me was that the impact of these programs and projects on Europe is absolutely unclear. We didn't find any sort of scientific published evidence on that. Then we checked with REA, but there also is no internal evaluation. So I think that would also be just a relatively straightforward thing to do, to look into how can we design these programs so that they're actually useful and usable in crisis. And then, of course, Maarja has already talked about the clear need to be multidisciplinary. The second point that is, of course, very typical for crisis is that there is no time. So also there, more flexible mechanisms and really a pool of experts that you can then pull in if needed is probably much more workable than, issuing a standard call for project proposals, which will then be starting like 6 months later. And there are mechanisms that we described, for instance, in the US, but of course also the scientific advice mechanism of the EU may provide some wonderful opportunities here, together with the EGE, to move forward on that.
Fantastic, thanks. And Shivangi, Chavda, I would love to bring you into this question as well, since we've highlighted the importance of basing policy on evidence. How can we better make that connection using the types of examples you were talking about? What's needed to make sure that policymaking can be based on evidence?
Yeah, I think if I cite an example from GNDR itself, that we recently completed a program called Views from the Frontline, where we have collected voices of 100,000 people from 50 countries on risk and resilience. And it throws lights on so many aspects as to what is happening actually on ground when we are talking about risk and resilience, and what are the factors which are preventing them their inclusion, what is their enabling mechanism, what legal structures are there, what are the gaps in the development processes, what are challenges in coherence. Well, coming to when we're talking about the scientific evidence, I think it's more important that if we want to really empower the community to be able to take actions by themselves, it's important to demystify the science and bring this learning to the community. Till the time we do that, I think yes, structurally and because of the governance patterns that what we have, it will still be top bottom. But I think if you want to reduce the impact on the communities, it's important that the science reaches in the most simplistic way to the communities for them to take the actions and reduce their own impact due to such disasters. And I think this is a great learning that what we have. We are bringing climate experts right now within GNDR to the people, to the communities, to talk and see that how this blended knowledge will help them to reduce the impacts of climate change and what adaptation measures that they can take. So there are several such examples, but I think there's more and more need of that we don't, if I may use word, let not this science be for the elites. Let that science kind of, devolve and come to the local level for the people to understand their science and act appropriately. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Shivangi, Chavda, for that important point on building public trust. We're almost out of time, but Hans Das, I would love to come back to you now for a brief word on this point.
Yeah, no, because it is such a crucial point, and perhaps there is a lot more going on than is publicly seen or known. But within the ERCC here in Brussels, we have a very strong and a very good analytical team which focuses exactly on these sort of issues. So a lot of the work that we do in crisis response and during crisis is rooted and based in scientific evidence. And so we have a lot of in-house scientific expertise. We work very closely with the Joint Research Center. We've also set up scientific networks specifically for our crisis centers. So we have a network with some 30 research centers for natural disasters. We have a smaller network for radiological risks, where we can very quickly, within 30 minutes, get a first sort of scientific advice from any of these networks. And And then after a couple of hours, that gets refined and made more solid, sort of into a more deeper analysis. For instance, now just in terms of recent example, when President Zelensky announced that Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine was potentially mined by the Russians, we have immediately run an impact analysis to sort of see what sort of damage that would create, what sort of wave would be generated by that, how quickly would that reach Kherson, etc., etc. And that was shared with the Ukrainians, with our US colleagues, with pretty much the whole world. So I think we're already quite good at some of these elements, but I do want to develop this further, and we are growing the team. We're also setting up a new sort of instrument, which will be called STAFF. So that will be a scientific and technical advisory facility where we hope to work much more closely with the scientific advisory mechanism at European level. But the key point in all of this, again, is anticipation. The more we can do in advance of a crisis, the easier it becomes during a crisis. And that's why we're now putting a lot of focus on developing these scenarios, which are very generic scenarios. I mean, this is not super specific or detailed, but they basically allow us to identify operational needs that are likely to emerge during a certain type of crisis, and that we can then try and cover through rescEU, the strategic reserve, etc. But equally, and perhaps even more importantly, it also allows us, these scenarios, to identify information and organizational needs. So we need to be clear, if tomorrow there is a decision to use a nuclear weapon of mass destruction in Ukraine, we need to be very clear about what the sort of information are that we need in the first 2 hours, in the first 6 hours, and in the first 24 hours, etc., where we can get it, how reliable it's likely to be, and how we're going to organize ourselves to share that information with those who need to know. And I think that is where anticipation is the key to many of the issues mentioned here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans-Das, for underlining that point on anticipation, preparedness, planning, really crucial. Sadly, time is not on our side and we're already a little bit over time, but I would like to squeeze in 3 more minutes just to hear from our first 3 speakers for your final thoughts. What will you take from this discussion? And can I ask you to be really as brief as possible? Maybe I'll come to you first, Tina, to ask what stands out for you.
Yeah, of course, it has been an inspiring and very long discussion for me. What stands out is really still stands out really the need to have this so one, the need to coordinate across all levels, and then also the need to what was just said, to anticipate and prevent. We called it in our report, for instance, for the data side, data preparedness and anticipation. And what I would really also like to say is that there we have to go beyond sort of the direct impact assessment. We are really very good in, for instance, predicting earthquake damage. I look at the picture behind David, or meteorological assessments, but we really need to also think about this broader science advice. What does it mean for economic impact? What are the potential indirect impacts? What are the implications for inequality? What is about social cohesion? What will it do on the long term? Education is also one of the points that came forward. So to go beyond the direct impact assessment, where we are fantastic, and integrate this longer term perspective, not just, if it explodes, what do we do in the next 7 hours, but also how will our response to that then influence our strategic pathways. And of course, if that's all being done already, I'm super happy, but I still think there is a lot more that can be done.
So going beyond that initial impact assessment, thank you, Tina. Maarja, your thoughts?
Yeah, first, I would like to congratulate Hans for very great work on ERCC, and this is one of our recommendations also from our opinion to strengthen it even further. You've done a really good work, in my opinion. Just a few words about the anticipation. Again, I was sitting in a workshop with an economist who said that our biggest problem in crisis prevention is lack of imagination. And when we were requested as a scientific opinions 1.5 years ago, we were given like terms of reference or a scoping paper. And one of the explicit requirements was not to look to military contracts. And then half a year over, this is where we were. And I have a luxury of being an independent scientific advisor, so I can say what I want to say. That I think these recommendations and evidence still fall short of what we do in case of a military conflicts. For example, coming back to this decision making, how do you help a decision maker in a case where she has to make a decision to use force? And this is maybe the best option that there is. And I here resonate very much with HP, who says we have to start treating citizens and grown-ups. And if they haven't been grown up yet, I think the time is coming, they have to grow up very fast. So we're actually getting into a place where we have to really take the gloves off.
Many thanks, Maarja, for underlining this important point. And the final word to you, Barbara, as briefly as possible. Your final thoughts on
what stands
today's
out?
discussion.
What stands out? Bring people from different disciplines together, from different fields of practice. Listen to communities whenever you can. Don't assume, but ask and think out of the box.
Fantastic. A really important note to end on, an interconnected response to a set of interconnected crises. It remains for me to thank all of today's speakers very much for this discussion. It's been really interesting. Sorry to everybody in the chat that we haven't had the chance to address every question, but thank you for raising them. And many thanks as well to David and Theodota, our fish that joined our fishbowl discussion. Thank you for bringing in your challenges. We look forward to continuing this conversation, and please do check the sapea website. There will be a series of discussions to be launched around this scientific opinion and evidence review report. Again, many thanks to all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing the discussion together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.